The Cost of Silence by J.P. O'Brien. La Voz feature piece, 5th of November 2001. On a mild April afternoon 39 years ago, more than 2,000 protesters crowded into the Plaza Central in Ciudad de Salto. They were calling for the release of notable political prisoners Federico Cartier and Ruben Savignon, both of whom had been incarcerated a month earlier for their outspoken opposition to the Morales regime. The modest square was packed beyond capacity. Protesters held signs and sang songs, and many of them wore colourful red and purple bougainvillea bracts on their lapels and hats, a recognised symbol of the resistance. Cartier's own wife was in attendance to read some excerpts from his letters and journals, speaking of dignity and endurance. "We must all remember our duty," he had written. "To keep making noise when to remain silent would be easier." There was a palpable optimism in the air. The main event of the day was to be a performance of Corazón Perdido by the one and only Don Carlos. At 4:02 p.m., he took the stage, guitar in hand, and stepped up to the microphone. Every pair of eyes in the plaza was trained on him.
"I want all of us to sing this together,"
he said, in his trademark drawl. There was an eruption of cheers as he began picking the song's unmistakable opening notes. Less than a minute later, a rifle was fired into the audience. Panicked members of the crowd immediately began screaming and pushing in every direction. Don Carlos was hurriedly ushered from the stage. Troops from the civil guard who had been stationed around the plaza's perimeter tried, and failed, to regain control of the masses, as dozens more gunshots rang out. 27 innocent people lost their lives that day. In the 4 decades since, Don Carlos has refrained from commenting publicly on the tragedy. Once one of Monteluz's most beloved and outspoken musical icons, with a voice that could fill arenas, he was all but silenced overnight by the trajectory of his Corazón Perdido, from gentle folk song to symbol of resistance to the soundtrack for a massacre. But his silence speaks to a larger problem with the discourse of this country's history. If citizens still don't feel free, to this day, to speak of the most reprehensible and cautionary aspects of the Morales years, does that mean the dictator succeeded after all? What is our responsibility to remember or forget our own past? Is it worth protecting victims from pain if the sharing of valuable historical lessons is sacrificed? To put it another way, which is greater, the cost of truth or the cost of silence? In late 1961, Monteluz was still very much under the oppressive control of Generalissimo Valdés Morales. Since riding an aggressive economic policy to landslide popularity 4 years prior, he and his central committee had successfully infiltrated almost every branch of governance and dismantled once steadfast democratic institutions. The role of the military was no longer national defense. It was instead to eliminate political opponents, censor journalists and media outlets, and to punish all those deemed to be of subversive identities. But cracks of dissent were at last starting to grow. Many hundreds of thousands of students, workers, and intellectuals had clustered into counter-activist groups that sought to preserve free speech, uphold workers' rights, and wrestle the country back from authoritarianism. Protest marches arranged by one of the most prominent of these groups, the Fundación Decoro Moderno, had become commonplace around the country throughout 1961 and early 1962. The FDM set out to prove to anyone who would listen that Morales' stranglehold over the country was slipping. At around the same time, a song was unexpectedly earning a position of unparalleled significance. Originally a yearning ballad about lost love, Don Carlos's Corazón Perdido had been released just before Christmas 1961 to modest airplay on country and pop radio stations. Among its more memorable lines were, "Through the locked and heavy door, I know your voice will rise," and "When the sky is filled with shadows, we'll feel weaker, then turn strong. But the heart that beats beside me will beat where it belongs." And from its climactic choruses, "Even in silence, I hear you call, my corazón perdido, stronger than all." Though benign on the surface, many of the song's lyrics were commonly interpreted as a thinly veiled call for communal resistance and freedom, something Don Carlos denied at the time. But it was not long before his words were heard crackling through megaphones at demonstrations and marches throughout Monteluz. They had become the rallying cry for anyone who opposed its totalitarian government, evidently urging listeners to continue the difficult fight while promising that others were doing the same. It was therefore considered a significant step forward in the movement's momentum when Don Carlos agreed to perform the song at the upcoming Cartier-Sauvignon demonstration. Organised by the FDM, the gathering on 7th of April 1962 was to take place in Ciudad de Salto. Obrero Lopez, one of the FDM's principal organisers at that time, explains why.
We needed a city much smaller than Liberón so that we wouldn't attract the ire of the committee. Ciudad de Salto had a huge student population and was significant enough to show the whole country the progress we were making.
It was a tactic that the FDM had used a number of times before, recalls Enrique Cuevas, who assisted Lopez in putting several of these events together.
I can count on one hand the number of rallies that were actually held in the capital, he says. Even those were kept as small as possible.
At that time, Liberón still sat at the epicenter of Morales' regime. It was where the Central Committee met and where the military was based.
If we had done anything there,
adds Lopez,
he could have simply snapped his fingers and had all of us tossed in a cell. It just wasn't worth the risk.
But the Central Committee was not blind to the FDM's activities, regardless of their proximity. Unbeknownst to the organisers, Morales' SID, the Secret Intelligence Division, had already infiltrated Lopez's planning committee for the Ciudad de Salto event, with the ultimate aim to sabotage it.
It still makes me feel queasy,
admits Lopez, holding his hand to his brow as he talks.
Someone had been bribed to switch sides and spy on us. Then again, the Central Committee could just as easily have kidnapped their family members. They weren't playing by a rulebook.
On the day of the gathering, many undercover provocateurs mingled with the crowd, sporting the same bougainvillea bracts as the real protesters. Cristina Galicia was a student at the nearby Universidad Autónoma de la Ciudad de Salto, and remembers feeling unsettled. It certainly felt different from the ones I had been to before, she recalls. We had travelled to Velarde the previous month. Maybe it was just because the Salto one was so much bigger, I don't know. But some of the protesters were being a lot more aggressive than anything I had seen. My first thought was that people were just so fed up with everything. Galicia remembers protesters unfurling banners with heated slogans that were clearly designed to provoke a reaction. One of them displayed a crude cartoon of Morales with his eyes gouged out. You would quickly be arrested for that type of thing, Galicia warns, and anyone who had protested before would have known this. During the opening notes of Don Carlos's Corazón Perdido, these bad agents began to shout taunts at the civil guard troops in a brazen attempt to elicit a response. Several of them even threw small objects like stones and coins. Recounts Lopez,
Of course we knew that the civil guard would be there. We wouldn't have been able to stop that. But as long as everything stayed orderly, there wouldn't be anything they could do. I was at the side of the stage watching when Don Carlos started playing. And even though the song is so gentle, most people were swaying with their eyes closed. It suddenly seemed as if the peaceful crowd had turned hostile. I didn't know what was happening.
The civil guard, as was customary during the final years of the Morales regime, had their orders to react forcefully to any sign of resistance. The first gunshot made everyone's heart stop, remembers Galicia. And people around me were shoving to get away. Everyone was in a panic. The song stopped, or maybe it was drowned out by the shouting. A little boy near us tripped over and hurt himself. Eduardo pushed against the crowd to give him space and used his elbow to help the boy get up. Eduardo Galicia, Cristina's brother, held on to the boy who had evidently become separated from his parents in the rush. I was looking for his mother or anyone who may have been calling out to find him, she recalls. But by that point, people were screaming and running in every direction. It was utter chaos.
We rushed Don Carlos off the stage and I grabbed a megaphone, explains Lopez. The organizers were trying to quell the unrest in the crowd and get everyone out of the square, but at that point we could barely be heard. I could see the line of civil guards pushing everyone inwards. Some members of my team were even pulling at their arms to get them to stop.
Barely 10 seconds after the first gunshot, several more rifles fired throughout the plaza. The panic-stricken crowd became hysterical.
It felt like they were shooting at us from all sides, recalls Enrique Cuevas. They had trapped us. That was when I remember thinking it was a planned attack.
One of the rogue bullets pierced Eduardo Galicia's shoulder.
He jerked sharply to the side, remembers Cristina. I was screaming, and the lost boy hurried back into the crowd in tears. Eduardo collapsed on the ground and held his hand up to his neck. Blood was seeping through his jacket.
Cristina managed to enlist the assistance of 2 nearby protesters to carry her brother out of the square, but by the time they found some space on the other side of the road, he had lost too much blood. He passed away on the scene. Nicolás Carrillo, who had come to lend his voice to the demonstration with his partner Sofia, recalls helping another wounded audience member who had suffered a gunshot to the leg. "We were crouching on the ground while everyone was rushing around us," he says. "Sofia was tearing parts off her coat to help stop the bleeding, but the man was getting paler by the second until he just fainted. Then more people came up to us, asking me to help someone else. They must have thought I was a doctor." As the organizers fought to clear the area, crowds flooded through the surrounding side streets. Several demonstrators suffered injuries not from the actual gunfire, but from the ensuing crush.
"My only concern was protecting my son," says Thomas Garcia Salve, who took shelter with Julian, then aged 8, in the entranceway to the Hotel Grand, which sits overlooking Plaza Central. "I was pushing as hard as I could against the bricks with Julian tucked between my body and the wall. There were hundreds of people pushing past, bumping into me." It took less than 20 minutes for the entire crowd to disperse, leaving at least 24 lifeless bodies strewn in pools of blood on the paving stones. The entirety of Plaza Central was sealed off by civil guard troops. Lopez and his organizers, as well as any remaining civilians, were pushed to the other side of the blockade. "Plenty of our team ran away before that,"
he says,
thinking they would get arrested if the military caught them. Or worse.
Both Lopez and Cuevas were taken into police custody for questioning about the incident and their involvement in the FDM, but were ultimately released.
"And then when they let us go," says Lopez, "I just went home. It was the most surreal experience, how everything suddenly felt quiet."
In the days immediately following the Cartier-Sauvignon demonstration, official state press described the protest as a violent riot. They blamed agitators and outside extremists for the disturbance, while claiming that the 27 confirmed dead had been loyal to Morales. Their deaths merited swift and brutal retribution, they warned. When there was widespread condemnation of this rhetoric from world leaders, the Central Committee changed tack, attempting to suppress even the vaguest mention of the demonstration. Reports were scrubbed from news archives, while all registrations of injuries and deaths in Ciudad de Salto hospitals as a result of the incident were destroyed. There was no longer a death toll of 27, because no demonstration had ever taken place.
"Lies,"
comments Enrique Cuevas with an incredulous laugh.
"The CC didn't know whether to cover it up or use it to start another fire."
Obrero Lopez unequivocally agrees.
"Our demonstrations and marches had never had any trouble like that. Nothing even close. Innocent people lost their lives. To try and stir up yet more violence from it was just disgusting."
In the wake of the tragedy, Lopez, Cuevas and the FDM withdrew from organizing mass protests, but their work had apparently sparked a shift in momentum. Outrage quickly spread to the furthest corners of Monteluz, where strikes and acts of civil disobedience grew to be an almost daily occurrence. Around the globe, memorials and vigils were held on campuses and city squares in solidarity with the oppressed nation. Morales' carefully cultivated illusion of omnipotence and invulnerability quickly came untangled, and many of his most vital high-ranking officials, bureaucrats, and military officers started to distance themselves. Within 6 months, the Generalissimo had been ousted from power. "It was as if the spell had been broken," summarizes Nicolás Carrillo. People had finally been pushed too far. But what was to leave an even greater impression on the people of Monteluz in the months and years that followed was the eerie silence. There may have no longer been the looming threat of jail time for criticizing the Morales regime, but successive governments showed little interest in revisiting this difficult chapter of recent history. Citing collective trauma for the survivors and a nationwide longing for normalcy, an official Pact of Forgetting was instituted, its aim being to smooth society's transition back to a stable democracy with as little delay as possible. The resistance had won, but remaining silent was still easier, just as Cartier had warned. There are signs that this societal secrecy is finally coming to an end, however. One of the key pledges of the Almost campaign last year was to reopen the discussion, following pressure from a new generation both unafraid of the past and unwilling to bury its ghosts any longer. Good to his word, President Olmos established the Comisión para el Acceso a la Verdad, el Esclarecimiento y la Justicia, the Commission for Access to Truth, Clarification and Justice. Its principal focus is to investigate state abuses from the Morales years. In turn, Cristina Galicia, now a professor of sociology at the University of Liberón, set up a society-led archival project called the Heart Foundation, dedicated to the memory of victims like her brother. She now liaises closely with former FDM organisers López and Cuevas to collect as many first-hand accounts as possible from that period, seeking to undo years of repression and provide resources for historians, journalists and survivors alike. It is thanks to the vital work of Galicia and the Heart Foundation that several witnesses from the Cartier-Sauvignon demonstration have finally felt able to break their silence after nearly 4 decades. The testimonies that appear in this piece would not have been available to Lavos without them. But there is one missing piece of the puzzle, and perhaps the most significant piece of all. The man literally at centre stage that tragic day, Don Carlos. Those who remember the star before 1962 speak of a spirited troubadour with a talent and wit that oozed from his fingertips, whose career was on an upward trajectory throughout the late 50s and early 60s. Since then, his public appearances have been so rare they can be counted on one hand. Following on from the Heart Foundation's work supporting survivors and the Olmos administration's pledge to restore historical clarity, Don Carlos has recently announced that he will be performing Corazón Perdido publicly for the first time since 1962. He recently invited Lavos to discuss his participation in the upcoming 40th anniversary memorial event of the Cartier-Sauvignon demonstration in Ciudad de Salto. We are welcomed into a large but unpretentious home on the outskirts of Platillo by Don Carlos himself, who leads us to a spacious, tastefully decorated sitting room. The mahogany wall above the mantelpiece shows framed photographs, not ostentatious spreads of himself alongside fellow rock stars in studios or arenas, but cherished personal moments with family members. It is perhaps as far from a former pop idol's dwelling as it is possible to get. Even so, you can't take the pop idol out of the man. One of the first things Don Carlos does is proudly show off his Ramirez 1A guitar.
From 1959.
He says, using that trademark drawl for sentence fragments, as though respectfully agreeing to utter only the essential. The guitar is a beautiful instrument befitting its owner, classic, graceful, rich with history, and with the scrapes and nicks on its body to prove it.
The guitar I always wanted,
he adds. But when asked if he'll play it for us, he simply flashes a coy smile, then replaces it carefully on its stand. We ask about his current relationship with music.
I still play every day,
he replies,
even if it's not usually in front of anyone. And I'm constantly listening. That has never changed.
He points out the wall to his right, shelves upon shelves of records and CDs that must document the entire course of popular music. But when asked how he feels about the countless performers who list him as an influence, many of whom refer to him as the Godfather of Folk, he is quick to brush it aside.
Oh, I don't know about that,
he laughs.
A lot more people have lasted a lot longer than I did.
It is impossible not to be charmed by his gentle manner. He somehow makes you feel as if he is inconveniencing you. After a little initial discomfort, he relaxes into our interview, bracing himself for the inevitable prodding about his fateful Ciudad de Salto performance.
After the song got on with the movement, the FDM reached out to me,
he says.
They were very eager. I was conflicted, of course, because I wanted to avoid any trouble with Morales. But at the same time, I couldn't help but appreciate the significance. It felt important.
And yet, despite countless sold-out shows in venues as large as the Auditorio Nacional and the Estadio Julio Aranda, Don Carlos admits to feeling uncharacteristically nervous ahead of the Plaza Central performance. Perhaps he knew the political tension would come to a head on the day.
Could be,
he answers.
I don't put too much stock in premonitions, but some things we just don't know. With the hundreds of guards around the plaza, it definitely felt less like a normal show and more like we were on a battlefield. Culture, music, art during those times, it took on a new role.
What does he remember seeing from his vantage point overlooking the crowd?
Honestly, not much. I was pulled off the stage when I'd only just started to play. I don't even remember hearing the first gunshot. But I saw the crowd moving erratically, and not in an enjoying the song way. Obviously, something was terribly wrong.
Manolo San Juan, Don Carlos's manager,
shielded me and pushed me into the car, and we quickly drove away. That was when I was aware of gunfire for the first time.
Did he think his own life was in danger?
We were always a little frightened of that in those years, weren't we?
In the time since Don Carlos took the stage in Ciudad de Salto, there has been plenty of speculation surrounding the tragedy. Some claim that the initial rifle shot did not come from one of the civil guard troops positioned on the ground, but was actually a planned attack from a nearby rooftop. Others maintain that a soldier simply had a human response to the thrown stones and verbal abuse, which set off an unfortunate chain reaction. But all agree that Don Carlos's song had provided the catalyst. Indeed, the tragedy of the 7th of April 1962 has come to be unofficially known by many as the Corazón Perdido massacre.
That was the turning point,
he says,
of so many lives, not just my own. Someone, somewhere, decided that this song was the trigger. It makes me feel awful. If I hadn't performed it, or even written it, people would have lived. I had many, many sleepless nights.
Being tethered to such a pivotal historical moment ultimately proved too burdensome for the man, and he processed that pain by retreating inward. He proceeded to pull out of all planned performances and opted out of his recording obligations with Crystal Records. San Juan could do little to help him. In 6 short months, even though culture, music, and art were once again flourishing in the wake of Morales' departure, Don Carlos was already long gone.
I fell into a deep depression,
he admits.
I drank, I was destructive, I didn't leave the house for weeks at a time. I didn't know what to do, but it didn't seem right to play. The music I knew didn't feel like it fit anymore.
There were, however, rare occasions of Don Carlos being successfully coaxed out of his reclusivity. When awarded the coveted Velaro Prize for his contributions to the culture of Monteluz in 1983, he accepted an invitation to play, and, to the delight of an astounded audience, performed 2 hits from earlier in his career, Ya no me conoce and Fuente de la Juventud. He received the accolade to rapturous applause, but when asked by a journalist after the ceremony about Corazón Perdido, famously declined to comment.
That happened back when I wanted, more than anything, to leave that song behind. Not enough time had passed yet, I suppose, and I still felt cripplingly responsible.
An earlier effort had also been made to revive the song. In 1974, a Crystal Collection re-release of the 45 RPM single grandly proclaimed it to be a beloved song that defined a generation. But public reception was poor. With only 12 years having passed since the tragedy which many had been conditioned to repress, and without any actual involvement from the troubled artist himself, many considered it to be an inappropriate move by Crystal Records.
Like I say, I didn't really want to think about it anymore.
Don Carlos sighs.
Just let them do what they do. Maybe they were right to try, in a way. The country needed to heal.
That healing appears to be well underway now, though. Since 1996, Don Carlos has maintained an unlikely correspondence by post with Cristina Galicia, and the two of them have grown to become close friends. It was during these letters that Cristina first proposed her idea to set up the Heart Foundation.
I love Cristina. She was the first person who got through to me when they said I didn't need to feel guilty. At first, I wouldn't listen. I couldn't bear to think what she had been through with the loss of her brother, but that just made her more determined to seek justice. I think what she's trying to do now is not only noble, but crucial. For whatever reason, it seemed she wanted to start with me.
What better place to start than the heart? Cristina Galicia told La Voz recently. Enough time has passed. Don Carlos is eager to see the culmination of Cristina's hard work next spring. An anniversary demonstration to commemorate the victims, the unveiling of a memorial in the Plaza Central, and, of course, a performance of Corazón Perdido by the man himself. All of which brings a long overdue challenge to the pact of forgetting that has weighed down Monteluz since the time of Morales. Although at first he admits he felt a familiar conflict, and it fell to Cristina to get him to change his mind.
Well, like back in 1962, I didn't know if I would be able to, he says. But in one of her letters, Cristina told me her family was expecting the arrival of her first grandchild. They were going to name him Eduardo. It was then I realized we do have a real responsibility to honor the past, or it dies with us.
In the spirit of the Heart Foundation's search for truth, then, are we able to finally get the real answer? Was Corazón Perdido originally written with Morales in mind? Don Carlos smiles and turns his head to the side. He doesn't answer with words, but he doesn't need to. His silence speaks volumes. You have been listening to the By Torchlight podcast. For more, visit patreon.com/bytorchlight or search By Torchlight on Spotify and YouTube.